Hello, everyone. Well, welcome to another episode in the long-running story of my life. It's getting faster. Yesterday, we got through pretty much the 1990s. It had taken a very long time talking about the 1980s. I always think as one gets older, that time seems to go more quickly. I think it's somehow proportional. It's just the fraction of time that you really notice. A year now is a smaller fraction of one's lifetime, my lifetime, than a year back in 40 years ago or something. In any case, I also somehow the projects that I've done have gotten bigger. And so in many cases, it's just like, here's the thing. And I don't have to. And there were many, many different detailed things that happened inside the doing of the project. But you can kind of summarize the whole thing as in, here's the project. Well, so I had talked about it launched a company, Wolfram Research, back in late 1986. I'd said kind of my plan A in developing kind of studying complex systems and kind of simple programs in the computational universe. My plan A in the mid 1980s had been sort of build the institutional structure and then get lots of other people to join the fun and be part of the science. My plan B was set up the tooling and the environment so that I could have the opportunity to pick as much of the low-hanging fruit of the science that I thought could be done as possible. And that was my plan B, was what caused me to start the company and build what then Mathematica, now Wolfram Language, and start working on my book, New Kind of Science. As I was saying, I had thought that the New Kind of Science book that I started in 1991 would be kind of a year and a half type enterprise. It turned into more like a 10 and a bit year enterprise. And because I discovered vastly more than I expected to discover, I wrote the book very slowly. Every picture was sort of a painstaking effort. And I laid the book out myself because it was, and occasionally there would be things that I only wrote those things because I was trying to kind of fill out a whole page so that there wouldn't be a gap on the page, so to speak. And they're pieces of science that I got done and that people have followed up from just because I wanted to fill a page, which is a little bit of a funky thing. As the book developed, it was kind of getting longer and longer. Time was more and more time was passing. And it was the intention had always been to print it as a printed book. And the binding technology that we were using kind of maxed out at 1280 pages. So the book came right in at 1280 pages. And that was kind of when I had to stop. The physical technology of printing and binding the book wouldn't have survived any further. I have to say, I was a little bit concerned that people would think, oh, this is a terribly long book. And so I ended up not numbering the pages in the index, which was also a long index. I think I had, at some point along the way, I kind of enjoy making indices. I like organizing information. I've always liked organizing information. It's what led me to do things when I was a kid, what led me eventually to build things like Wolfram Alpha, and I suppose Wolfram Language and so on. And so somehow making an index is a very it's a kind of a relaxing activity for me, and it's kind of like putting all those pieces cognitively together. It's always when I make indices, I tend to put in whatever words people might think they would look up in the index, even if they weren't actually there on the page. I have to say, even today, I find indices useful. And when I've made indices for books I've put out recently, I find the index more useful than just doing a web search or an LLM search or whatever else, because there's kind of additional cognitive content that's added by the index. In any case, the NKS book, New Kind of Science book, was sort of eventually limited by its printing technology. And but it was also limited by the fact that I had always intended, actually, I'd intended there'd be 13 chapters. There ended up being 12 chapters. The 13th chapter is sort of predicting the future, the epilogue. I never ended up writing. I wrote drafts of it. I never wrote the whole thing. And I looked at it a few times since, and it actually was surprisingly interesting in terms of nailing a bunch of things that actually did happen in terms of the development of the science. But I had gradually filled out over the course of that decade kind of the chapters that I had intended to write, but many of them got much bigger, much more elaborate than I had expected. And I have to say, something that's been very satisfying to me in the years since is that, for example, chapter 10 about processes of perception and analysis, that was kind of a little bit of an orphan chapter to me for a long time. Until recently, I started working on observer theory and so on, and it's really all about that chapter. And the same has happened in many other parts of the book. I feel like what I wrote in that book has, which took a long time to write, was really a valuable kind of piece of foundational work on which I've been able to build ever since. And it's been sort of satisfying that with Wolfram Language, again, I've sort of built a foundational thing that I've been able to continue building that tower for a long time. To me, it's been a good way to sort of lead my life. And it's more satisfying to have these things that you can progressively build on. And I kind of really started that, I suppose, in 1986, building things that would be my sort of permanent platforms, so to speak. Well, in working on the NKS book, mostly I was really a hermit because I basically didn't want input from people because every time I got input, I would get distracted, and I was pretty much just running the company as a remote CEO, and then working on the book. I kind of thought in those years that the company might sort of stage a coup, and somebody else would come in and say, "I can run this company much better than you can." Unfortunately, that never happened. I had for a number of years, I had a chief operating officer back up until about 1995. And then kind of the challenge there was a good person at kind of stabilizing what was there in the company, not such a good person at building what was new. And after kind of 5 or 6 years of stabilization, it was time for something new. And I had to kind of jump back in again and actually then create version 3 of Mathematica and now Wolfram Language in 1996. But the and things happened. I had a probably too small a group of people that I had working with me on the book. It was really just for a long time. It was really one person, two people, a few people. Towards the end of the project, I pulled in a whole bunch of other people, very good people who many of whom I still work with, or they are off sort of retired, and I interact with them from time to time. A very, very good group towards the very end. And I should have probably accelerated that process earlier in the project. It also didn't help in the towards at the few years before the project finished. A few pieces of kind of academic skullduggery. I mean, this very hermit done project, which was not really intended for the world, so to speak. And I had experienced, I think I mentioned maybe one or two instances of this in my life as an academic, lots of academic skullduggery and thievery and so on. My general principle had been the big picture things are just not things. They're not a thing where you can sort of pick it up and walk off with it type thing. And I would say that the experience, and I've talked to many other kind of people who've done stuff in science, some notable stuff in science and so on. And I think it is a very common feeling that, as far as I'm concerned, I mostly like doing the science. And if the science gets out there and people pick it up and do exciting things with it, that's wonderful. That's a great kind of feeling. But the one thing that annoys everybody, including me, is when you feel like somebody stole something. And I think, even people who will say to me, "Oh, yes, we just like doing the science and so on," when you bring up something where somebody sort of stole something, they get very annoyed. And they say, "Yes, somebody stole something," and they're very upset about it. And and so that happened to me a whole bunch of times. I guess my usual position, other than just had been, I'm doing lots of other things, but it always annoyed me after the fact. And then when I was working on NKS, a couple of things sort of that sort of dropped out for very random reasons as being things that sort of there was thievery to be done on, and that was quite annoying. And I ended up uh, handling these things in the I tried to delegate the handling of these things, and that made the handling somewhat heavy-handed. But the things that have been done were really fairly outrageous, and it was quite remarkable to me that given my sort of kind of presence in the science world and the tech world and all this kind of thing, that anybody would think that it made sense so they could get away with it. And it was just a remarkable and bizarre thing. And maybe I'll tell those stories sometime, but perhaps not now. I will say that it was not two examples of things that were not just. It's a very surprising thing that even given that sort of all the cards were stacked in my favor, people still tried to do fairly outrageous things, and that didn't help. But in any case, the thing with the science was it was just I had a lot of fun doing the science, and it was a grinding process because I was just in the end I was writing particularly these notes at the back of the book. The notes got bigger and bigger. The notes were partly about history and partly about more detailed and specific technical things that came out of the book. Many of those notes I have now turned into 100-page treatises. They were things where I had tried to do sort of the core piece back when I was working on the NKS book, but there was much more to be done, whether it's about kind of empirical metamathematics or combinators or other kinds of things. In any case, by the book was finally coming to an end by around the year 2001. And it was a question of what was going to happen with the book, because I'd always planned it as a book. And at the beginning of the project, we'd had these successes with the Mathematica book, and I was kind of, and there was also a time, this was in the beginning of the 1990s, when there was sort of quite a thing going of popular science books and so on. And, there'd been Brief History of Time, and there had been, I don't know, Gödel, Chaos, all these books had been kind of things where it had seemed like there were books that had some intellectual content, or at least, but had kind of managed to get an audience that was beyond the sort of the merely technical, so to speak. And I thought that was sort of an interesting thing to potentially go for, because I knew that what I was trying to write about was kind of foundational stuff, and I didn't feel like the technical experts had much advantage over everybody else. So I thought, why not step up to the challenge of writing something that can be broadly understood? So this was beginning of the 90s, and we had been working, at that time with Addison Wesley Publishing Company, published the Mathematica book. And I was like, okay, maybe I'll publish this with you guys, but let's understand who buys popular science books and, what is that market? And so I made up this survey to get done in bookstores and so on to just find out some of these things, who have people heard of? Why did they buy the books and so on? It was somewhat pathetic, in the sense that the publishing folk were like, we don't do things like this. We're not a business, we're not an industry where people do these kinds of very sort of tight marketing kinds of things. And, we just, we don't have any control over the books we get. We just kind of, we sort of throw them at the wall and see what happens. One thing an editor, another publishing company told me, sort of his theory was that popular science books were bought by people who would otherwise have bought philosophy books, but philosophy was by then too technical, and so this was kind of the substitute. Not a totally bad theory, but it would have been nice to validate that theory. In any case, I think we sort of unwound our relationship with Addison Wesley because of the chap who'd been Alan Wilde, the chap who'd been sort of the editor for the person responsible for the original Mathematica book, had done that as a piece of his kind of outlying part of the company. But the way he negotiated his bonus or something was such that year he, made more money than the CEO or some such other thing. And in the pathology of an industry like that, the result of having a person who performed, too well was fire the person. So he was gone, and the sort of the new guard wasn't really very good for us to work with. We ended up moving the Mathematica book to Cambridge University Press for a while. It went through many editions, so we were then, so in a few years into the 1990s, it was kind of like, okay, what's the publishing story for the new kind of science book going to be? And so kind of interacted with all sorts of people. I knew many people in the publishing industry. And, you'd go to these publishing companies in New York City where everybody was wearing a fine tweed jacket. But when you asked about things like, well, how does the distribution of books work in country X? They're like, well, we just do very fine editing, but we don't know about crass commercial things like that. So I wasn't too impressed with that because I knew perfectly well that the actual printing and producing of the book was not so difficult. And one of the issues is that most of the time authors of books kind of need the advance. They need, it's kind of like this is the way it works is that's how the author is getting paid. And the author, the publishing a book is a sort of small scale venture capital bet of, let's put a few $100,000 or whatever it is into this book and see how it does. That wasn't a situation that I was in. I didn't need the publishing company's money to front the money to print books and so on. And it was also the case that in the publishing industry, there was sort of a formula that said, you pay X number of dollars in royalties. That's the number of dollars that you pay in promotion as well. And then the production cost of the book is some fraction of that money, sort of a very formulaic kind of thing. Well, as far as I was concerned, the NKS book, I knew it was going to be a big book. I knew it was going to be a book with very elaborate pictures in it. But I also wanted it to be a book that was widely available to people and not at a very high price. And so all of these constraints made sort of the publishing story really quite complicated. And went through, talked to a bunch of publishers. There were some folks at a division of Simon & Schuster, the large publishing company, that were sort of very into the book and was like, oh yes, we'd like to do this. And so we started negotiating some contract with them, and it was a painful process because they had this kind of printed contract. They said, this is how we do books. And we said, well, basically none of the clauses in here will work. So it's like, but they said, but we really want to start from this printed contract. So basically every clause is crossed out and something new is substituted for it. And then let's see what happened. There was a whole tale of woe there. That was in the I would say the mid 1990s. There were many crazy things that happened, but I, for example, well, I said this must have been, yeah, this was around that time. I said, look, they're like, we're a publishing company. We know how to publish books, etc. And I was like, yes, you know how to get books into bookstores. That's something that, you have salespeople who go around and do that. You have existing relationships that allow that to be done. That's all good. That's what I need and want. But most of the other stuff that you do, like having an editor go through and say, change those commas, I don't need that. First of all, I have my own people to do that. And second of all, I'm frankly not going to listen to you. So the one place where this sort of came up was in doing cover design. They're like, we can do a great cover design. And I'm like, look, I have a company with a very strong design department. We've even won awards for packaging and all kinds of things like this. I think we can do, I'll put a lot more effort into doing a cover design than you ever will, and it's not on your dime. So it's kind of, it's a good thing. I said, and the one thing not to do, don't get some out-of-work art student to come up with some stupid design and send it to me because this will blow up the deal. Well, needless to say, the contributions from publishing company, I think I posted them in various places. They were amusing. Let's put it that way. They were, kind of atrociously bad, kind of simplistic, foolish kinds of efforts. So that didn't go well. And then there was another issue, which was when you print a book of the kind that NKS is with high resolution pictures, there's a question of how do you do that? How do you do that in a cost-effective way? And there's a way of doing that that involves a so-called web press nothing to do with the World Wide Web. It's it's the description of the printing technology. It's this giant industrial machine where paper is going at 100 miles an hour or something through the thing, and you can press go, and pretty soon you have 1,000 books printed or something. There's very little control over what happens. So if you're trying to make sort of a really high resolution, sort of artistically created piece of printing, that's not the way to do it. But I knew perfectly well that if you can run things on a web press, it's much cheaper. A sheet-fed press is much more expensive. It involves much more labor and so on. And they were like, "Oh, trust us. We can do this printing technology, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera." And I'm like, let us show you. Let's do a test to prove it. And I said, actually, I don't think it was me directly saying this at this point. I said, look, under no circumstances run a test on a sheet-fed press and claim that it's on a web press. And we don't believe you can run a test on a web press because it's too expensive to have the thing kind of ramp up to do this process. Like, oh, no, 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 it's all whatever. So they sent us the sample, and it has, the registration marks for a sheet-fed press. And we're like, come on, guys, don't bullshit us like this. So anyway, so we kind of killed that effort. Meanwhile, I think for some quite different reason, and a more benign reason, Cambridge University Press had kind of blown up as the publisher for the Mathematica book. And so we had started our own Wolfram Media company to publish the Mathematica book and other things. So we were in a pretty good position to actually produce a book, and which is what we ended up doing. I mean, interestingly, I had met in interacting with the Simon Schuster guys. Actually, I'd met this publicist who worked for them, who I thought was quite good. I thought I wasn't so impressed with some of the other people, but I thought he was quite good. By the time the NKS book was coming out, he was a freelancer, and so he worked on the book. And actually, another woman who had been a salesperson for that publishing company did some book sales for us. Although actually, our person who ran our software sales effort at the time did actually much better in selling books to the very small number of vendors that you have to sell books to get them out in the world. It also helped that I knew kind of Jeff Bezos and the Amazon story, and Amazon was by that point, the emerging kind of force in book selling by 2001, 2002. So in any case, I finished the book in January of 2002. One of the things that was happening in my sort of personal life, our oldest three kids were up and about, and we'd been living near Chicago in a town called Hinsdale. It's a suburb of Chicago, and it was kind of like, okay, but we could live anywhere because I'm a remote CEO. So where's a good place to live? And kind of the Boston area ended up being the one where we sort of thought we knew the most people and sort of thought it was a good place to be. And so we bought a plot of land, actually in a piece of kind of strange trivia. I had known that the US Geological Survey sold these big aerial photograph pictures, and we were trying to find, where can we buy a nice big plot of land and so on. And that was sort of found by looking at those aerial photographs. Subsequently, I mentioned this to my friend Nathan Myhrvold, who was by that point CTO at Microsoft, and I think that was it was like those aerial photographs became sort of fodder for some big database project there that ended up in a bunch of satellite mapping kinds of things, I think. So in any case, so then we started building some house in Concord, Massachusetts, and that was my wife's project. I've learned that I've been happily married for many years, and it's like I have my project, she has her projects. The house building was her project, and eventually I finished the NKS book, I think January 15th of 2002. And then we moved to the new house in March, and I'd not seen it. It was kind of like, oh, we drive out there, and it's kind of like, well, I'd only seen the house in its plans in AutoCAD. And so it was like, this is a lot bigger than I thought it was going to be. Anyway, it's a very, very lovely house. Um, the but So we kind of moved everything in the months between when the NKS book was finished and when the NKS book was going to be published. And the publication date was set for May 14th of that year, and we started doing all sorts of things in preparation for that. And I think the um, well, then finally, sort of it got to uh, it's being published, and then it started selling, and it started selling quite well. And there was a big sort of scramble of how do we get more books printed, and it went through quite a few printings, and all sorts of crazy things happened. Like we had one, I think it was Barnes and Noble had ordered some huge number of books. I have to say, in an eye-rolling part of the story, they managed to lose a giant truck, a giant container of books for about a week, which was a shame because we were kind of ascending the bestseller list. You kind of have to keep the momentum, and if you lose a whole truckload of books, it kind of damages that momentum. But they managed to lose it for a week or so. But in any case, there was sort of a drama of how do you get all these books printed, because we was having the book printed in Canada. It's a very typical thing to do. We had considered printing it in the Far East, but we knew that was too long a latency to get new books delivered, so to speak. It's not easy to get precision printing done. It's gotten a bit easier in intervening years. But in any case, we were printing the book in, I guess it was in uh, Winnipeg, I think. And the binding of the book was being done in Toronto, and the paper for the book was coming from a paper mill in upstate New York. And in trying to get the book printed, and that was a whole assembly of things, and when the first printing that had a long lead time, but by those subsequent printings, there was some where it's like we need 100,000 books, and how do we get 100,000 books? That's a lot of trucks of books. And there was I think it was over a holiday weekend. No, it must have been, I can't remember. But in any case, oh yeah, there were some other pieces to this story. But one of the things that ended up being more down to the wire than one might have liked was I eventually had to figure out, how do you get a truck from here to there? How long does it take to get a truck with a load of paper from the paper mill to the printer? How many different, how many things are they prepared to run in parallel? How do you get these things to be bound? How do you get them to distribution centers in the US and so on? It was, I have too many charts of, kind of how long it takes the truck to go from here to there and so on. But we managed to get these things done, even though the truckload of books got lost in the end, or one truckload got lost. But even in the setup to the printing of the book, there had been another piece of drama, which was we were using a technology that was a sort of a new technology of direct-to-plate printing. So normally, when people had made books, like when we made the Mathematica book, you make printing films, you make film, negative film, that is then used to actually etch out metal plates that are then printed from. But by the time of the NKS book, there was a new technology where you could have a RIP, raster interface processor, I think it's called, that would directly kind of write with a laser, presumably an ultraviolet laser, onto a printing plate, and then could etch the printing plate directly. And by doing that, you could get higher resolution in the final output. So we thought, let's do this. Well, the only problem with it is you don't get to have proofs, because the only way that you can see what's on those printing plates is to look at the plates or actually start printing the book. And so we sent somebody to the printer in Canada to go look at the plates, and he came back and said, "Well, there's this plate where there's a glitch there's a pattern that's supposed to be symmetrical and it's not symmetrical. And how can this be? And so this was over a holiday weekend. I remember that, and it was we were dealing with yeah, I remember it was we must have already moved to the new house, so this was right down to the wire because I remember wandering around talking on a cell phone, trying to talk to different people about this. And it's like, how could this possibly be? This book is represented in PostScript. The PostScript is being rendered on this device that's etching printing plates. How could it possibly be that there's this glitch where the left-hand side and the right-hand side of the symmetrical pattern aren't symmetrical? The PostScript is correct, but the thing that's actually etched on the plate is not. So I ended up contacting, well, in the end, the printing company said we don't have any idea. And I contacted, in the end, I got to the CTO of the company that made the laser raster image thing, and he was like, "Yeah, I guess it must be some problem with sort of momentum in the laser or something, or some hardware problem." And then the question was, but maybe it's actually a problem with PostScript. And so I had known, well, John Warnock particularly, who was one of the founders of Adobe. So I got hold of him, and it's like, wait a minute, there's this PostScript, and here's what's rendered and what's going on. Well, to make a long story short, it ended up being a bug in PostScript that had been there for at least a decade. And the problem was that in the images we had, there were sort of the pictures of like cellular automaton images and so on. The original image that went wrong was a continuous cellular automaton where kind of every pixel had a different value. Normally, when you have photographs, there's sort of a fairly continuous change of color gradient, continuous color gradient. But with these cellular automaton images, it's like every pixel for itself. And that was just a very rare thing that it just didn't come up very often. Anyway, it turned out to be a bug in PostScript. Turned out that when we reran it and generated new plates, we avoided that bug, and everything went on happily. But anyway, so then the book was out and about in the world, and people were responding to it. This was before social media, unfortunately, because it meant that the sort of dynamics of response were kind of very sort of old media and stylized. And so there was sort of the book reviews, and there were the kind of the things, the news articles and so on. And I have to say that the professional journalists did very well. Professional journalists did their work and did their sort of homework and produced, I would say in some cases, really very good kind of analyses and so on and all that. When it came to the scientists, some were exuberantly sort of optimistic, and some there was a particular gaggle of physicists, and this was particularly ironic to me because physics was a field where I pretty much knew all of the cast of at least senior characters by that point. And my book was mostly not about physics. My book was mostly about, as its title says, a new kind of science, thinking about simple programs as sort of a paradigm for thinking about nature and other things. I had a section about physics, which was a precursor to our later physics project, but I saw it as being kind of just this sort of a use case for this paradigm, which I said was an undeveloped use case for the paradigm, so to speak. But people in physics were like, wait a minute, this is a challenge to well, at that moment, it was kind of the string theory orthodoxy of we're going to solve physics. It's going to be all strings all the way down. So there was sort of a certain amount of aggression from some parts of the physics community, some parts not at all. I would say that as one got into fields which just didn't have models, whether it was sort of the soft sciences and so on, one got to people who were just much more immediately enthusiastic about what the whole NKS story could provide. When it got to an area like physics, where it's like we got our models and we're sticking to them type thing, there was less, in some areas there was plenty of immediate enthusiasm, but in other areas there was antagonism. And it was kind of interesting because, NKS book, people basically didn't know what was coming in it. And it was just like, okay, world, here it is. It's this new paradigm for thinking about things. We've been doing it one way for 300 years. This is kind of another thing. Obviously, there were precursors of it in work that I'd done in the 1980s, but it was very much of a, here's this big thing. And it got, I would say, people were in a sense forced to read it because it got enough kind of media coverage that people were going to ask science people, well, what do you think about this? And so people would read it. And I think it was quite inspirational for many people, but to other people, it's like, oh my God, we got to fight for the orthodoxy, particularly in physics. Actually, there was another area where there was sort of ironically some antagonism, which was among the people who were working on complex systems. They were people who had been kind of I would say, the people who, I had been launching that field in the mid 1980s, and a bunch of these people had kind of gotten involved in that field. And this was now, 15 years later, and they'd built sort of institutional structures and so on. And I wasn't part of that picture. Perhaps it was a mistake on my part to have kind of just completely exited that picture and not really, and had no kind of, there was no flag waving saying, hey, I'm still doing this stuff. I'm not sure how I would have done that anyway, but I was completely invisible. And so it was at least as far as that kind of science was concerned, I suppose I was visible in terms of our technology. But then sort of suddenly on May 14th, 2002, kaboom, there's this sort of big thing that's dropped in that field. And that led to remarkable, well, some quite interesting feedback. I remember the Santa Fe Institute, which, as you might remember, I had been the one who sort of seeded this do complexity type idea. Some journalist reported that the Santa Fe Institute had voted, 12 people against one or something, to not invite me to give a talk about new kind of science at their institute. Well, that was I thought that was interesting to see that from some journalist, and I haven't been there since. So that's how that cookie crumbles. But and I have no idea who, I'm sure the cast of characters has changed since then. But in any case, it wasn't. But the thing that was I have to say also there were many reviews of the NKS book and a lot written about it. I have to say that I suppose as a personal, I don't know, failing or advantage, I don't really know which, I never read this stuff. I mean, it seems like it can do no good. If it says wonderful things, you're kind of like, I don't know how to think about that. If it says terrible things, you just get annoyed. So you kind of can't win. And my only sort of exception to that is when I'm going to meet the person who wrote the thing, then I will make some effort to read it out of sort of respect for that person. But otherwise, I feel like it's for the world, not for me, so to speak. But I think so I haven't read still to this day the all the reviews of the NKS book. Actually, at the I think 10th anniversary, 15th, and 20th anniversary, I sent mail to people who'd written a bunch of these reviews. Some of them are not alive anymore, but sort of saying, hey, let's talk about it. Since we live in modern times with live streaming and social media and things like that, we have a venue where we can talk about whatever you wrote. None of them ever responded to my mail. So I don't know what that tells you, but that perhaps has some comment to make. But in any case, it was the thing that really surprised me among some of the physicists was, guys, don't you know enough about the history of science to know that sort of jumping on a new paradigm and saying, no, 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 the old paradigm is just great, isn't the smartest thing in the world to do. And because, you really don't know what's going to happen. And also, it surprised me that, among the physics crowd, they certainly knew me, and I had been a leading member of their herd, so to speak, in past years. Plus, essentially, all these people used our technology every day. So it's kind of like like a uh, um, it's one of these things where, for me, when I'm assessing all sorts of things that come my way, there's a certain amount of meta information that one always has about whether this thing is likely to be sensible or not. And I have to say, if I were assessing what I was doing, kind of, it would have a lot of meta information that, yeah, this is kind of not going to be totally crazy. It may not be something one would care about, but it's probably not totally crazy. It was kind of interesting in the preface to the NKS book, I kind of wrote that, you know, when even I had felt when I first discovered the things that are in that book, I couldn't really believe them, and I was kind of uh, pushing back a lot. And it took me a number of years, as I mentioned in these live streams. It took me a number of years to sort of come to terms with these phenomena that I was seeing. But so it wouldn't surprise me that somebody would sort of say, well, I just don't believe it, because it's like I didn't believe it at first. The one advantage of doing computer experiments is anybody can just do it again. You can, yes, it does what it does. There's no sense in which the experiment can be wrong, so to speak. But I said in the preface, in time, the things which now seem quite sort of shocking will come to seem obvious. And yes, we're 20 something years in, and that is coming to pass. And among younger people and so on, it's not uncommon that people feel like things like computational irreducibility and so on are kind of obvious, which is how I feel about them as well. But it's sort of interesting to see that arc from the shocking and implausible to the obvious in a few decades. But in any case, I think uh, the I'm trying to remember some of my favorites. There was one review, I suppose, that described the book as, what was it? I think total batshit insanity, which I rather enjoyed. I thought I didn't read what came under the title, but I think there was another part to the title. But I thought that was fun. But one of the more interesting conversations, which was quite revealing, was a conversation I had with a chap named Leo Kadanoff, who was a mathematical physicist who was writing something for, I don't remember, Physics Today, maybe, about the NKS book. And somehow I ended up talking to him about it. Maybe he even sent me some draft or some piece of something. I don't really remember. But anyway, I had known Leo for quite a long time. He was a pretty distinguished mathematical physicist, worked on statistical mechanics and so on. I never really had a sort of professional, actually, I had some interaction with him about, that's right, I had interaction with him about the cellular automaton fluids business. He was kind of a little bit of a skullduggerer in that business. But in any case, I get on the phone with him, and the first thing he says to me is, with great emotion, he says, "You're destroying the heritage that of mathematics and so on that's existed since ancient Greek times." And because the NKS book is all about a new kind of science that's based on simple programs, not kind of the more mathematical tradition. And so that was kind of an interesting thing for Leo to say, because my immediate response to that was, well, then it is an ultimate irony that I have done so well, sort of purveying the fruits of that tradition in Mathematica and so on. So that was an interesting start. But the thing that I was most struck by, and I said, was, Leo, I just don't know why you're so wound up about this. I could imagine that you would just sort of say, I don't care about this stuff. This isn't the way I do science. I don't care. I found it, but I think, he had taken it as really a personal affront to kind of the approach to science which he'd adopted. I mean, I have to say that I was well aware of enough of the history of science to know that kind of the reactions to sort of new paradigms when they're first introduced, the best thing that can happen is vigorous negative reaction. that is has the best, it's the prognosis, the long-term prognosis when there's vigorous negative reaction at the beginning is the best. And I well knew that. And so that was kind of a thing that I certainly had at the back of my mind, kind of observing some of the interaction. But then we went on in that conversation, and Leo was saying, oh, I don't remember all the details, but uh, was saying basically at some point he said, I look through this book and I just don't understand any of it. It's just a bunch of pictures and code. It's not, equations and so on. And I think my response to that was, well, Leo, that's the sound of a kind of that's the sound of a new paradigm. That's what happens when there's sort of a new paradigm for a new methodology for doing things. People who are used to the old methodology feel kind of lost. Well, so that was, I would say, emblematic of a certain kind of response. I think there's another chap, Scott Aronson, who's reappeared, who was then a graduate student who had written something about how the book had to be total nonsense because he had some argument. And I guess I talked to him and somebody else from our team talked to him and pointed out it's just what you're saying is just plain outright wrong. And independent of anything else. But it was like, I'm a young guy, I want to publish something, and so, people will publish it because it's kind of it's scandalous, so why not? I think Scott has done, I hope, more sensible things. I know he's done some quite different work in subsequent years. But I think then then there were other. There was. I remember Steve Weinberg, a well-known physicist whose book about gravitation and cosmology I had read when I was a kid, so to speak, and had was one of the things that sort of got me launched in thinking about cosmology. A good book. Anyway, he ended up writing a review of the NKS book, which I have to admit I've never fully read, but it was kind of a a strange kind of I don't get the point of this type thing. Steve Weinberg was a daily user of Mathematica, a very actually quite capable user of Mathematica. Um, but and he was a person who, for strange reasons, I had never met in my sort of life in physics. Actually, the reason was because my time at Caltech, um, Steve Weinberg had had a sort of a terrible falling out with Murray Gell-Mann, and so refused to ever visit Caltech. So it was so he was kind of one of the people, one of the very few people in the sort of theoretical physics domain who I hadn't met. But anyway, so a little while after this, I invite Steve to lunch, and to his credit, he said, "Sure, let's have lunch." And one thing that became clear was that he actually profoundly did not understand the NKS book, and he was like, "Well, I wish I had understood this before I wrote this review." When I explained to him, sort of, it's sort of this new paradigm thing, and I'm like, "Actually, I think I say that on page one." But he had a mindset that was very much oriented towards kind of his view of what it might be or should be or could be, and really wasn't informed by the actuality, so to speak. But and then I would say in subsequent years, I will say that well, there's more on Steve Weinberg, but well, then the so the book came out. The book made quite a sort of a splash. It became a quite big bestseller. We sold many hundreds of thousands of copies, and the book was not built as a money-making venture, so to speak. But it turned out, to my great surprise, it actually made quite a lot of money, probably more than I'd spent on it, which was nice. But that sort of wasn't its point at all. But it got pretty wide readership, and it's been spotted on lots of people's bookshelves. It's the big black and red, the black and yellow thing is it ended up with a nice dramatic cover that was designed by was actually started by our first and former art director and finished by our now current still art director. And it was I think I told the story of the creation of that cover in something I wrote about the making of the NKS book. But in any case, the uh, so the book was out and about and seemed to have made quite an impact, which was nice. And then, well, then it was kind of like people were like, "Oh, we want to hear more about this, etc." So I kind of resolved to do a lecture tour about it. Now, I have to say that um, right when the book was finished, I was pretty tired. I mean, somehow I've been working really hard on this, and particularly towards the end, and then we'd been moving house and so on. And I think it was it's one of the only times in my life when I really sort of felt quite tired. Actually, another thing that happened, yes, this is an interesting story. So when the book came out, there were various outfits that said, we want to make a documentary about this. It's like, okay, great. Okay, well, now we roll the time back by, what was it, 30 years or something, to probably 1980. I'm at Caltech, and there's a chap named Christopher Sykes who comes to Caltech to make a documentary about Dick Feynman. And it was a very good documentary. I think it was called The Pleasure of Finding Things Out. It's a widely seen documentary. And yeah, I've got a couple of stories to tell about that. The uh, it So anyway, makes this documentary, and then this let's see, there were multiple pieces to the story. So at that time, I ended up talking to Chris Sykes, a fine British filmmaker, and we had a lovely conversation. And at the end of the conversation, he just sort of said, "Oh, maybe in 25 years, I'll come back and do a documentary about you." So I thought that's kind of nice. It's, cute comment. Um, and then for some reason, we interacted again the beginning of the 1990s, and I can't really quite remember why. But then the book comes out, and there are a variety of organizations that wanted to make documentaries, and one of them was BBC. And there was a producer there who was very energetic, and sort of said to us, "Hey, do you have an idea for a director for this thing?" And so we said, "Well, what about this guy, Chris Sykes? He made this thing about Feynman." And I also remembered that amusing, comment from him. So I thought that's one of those lovely kind of irony stories, and let's make that happen. Well, so Chris Sykes, we sort of turn away the other folks who want to do this, and Chris Sykes shows up with his crew, and it's kind of like starts to do this, and like then freezes, like doesn't know what to do, and kind of, and I'm like, how can you not know what to do? You've made endless documentaries and so on. And eventually what became clear, and it was kind of, he's like, I can't do this. And then the producers talking back into it, and then, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Eventually he sort of said, look, um, you know, I'm just not used to making things when the end of the story isn't known. I make things about people who are dead or people who are sort of at the end of their careers. And this is kind of he said, this feels like trying to make a documentary about Darwin right after the publication of Origin of Species. And I'm like, well, if that's what it's like, isn't that the most remarkable, isn't that a terrific opportunity? And it's like, but I don't know what to do. So anyway, the end result, which was kind of a shame, was no documentary got made. In a sense, I was happy because I was really tired. And I just wanted to kind of, for one of the only times in my life, to just, I don't know what I really did to chill out. I probably did a bunch of things with the company, but to not be doing something that required sort of intense judgment calls. But in any case, then a few months later, we I did I guess the book came out at the beginning of the summer. By that fall, I did this sort of grand lecture tour of I don't know what, 30, 40 places around the US, chartered a plane, flew place to place to place to place, going and giving talks. It was very interesting in a sense. One thing that I found particularly interesting was that the audiences, you always expect the young at when it's new stuff, but actually the audiences were a lot of gray-haired folk. I have to tell a story about that from earlier times. Back in 1991, when Mathematica was young, we had our first, or maybe even 1990, we had our first Mathematica user conference. It was in Redwood City, California. And we were kind of standing around at this hotel, waiting for people to show up. And it's like, who are these people going to be? We didn't know who they were going to be. We at most had a kind of a name. And this was before the web, and you couldn't just look things up and look at the LinkedIn or whatever else. And so it was like, are these people going to be old? Are they going to be young? What's the story? It was very interesting. People started showing up, and it was sort of a uniform distribution of ages. And I kind of realized, and it's a thing I've seen many times now, that when sort of new things happen, new methodologies, new paradigms, new opportunities, there are people who have been kind of, going through their lives, and when there is a new opportunity that really resonates with them, they jump into it. And it doesn't matter if they're 50 years old or 20 years old. It's a thing where some set of people will jump in and get involved. And that's what I've seen multiple times. And it's kind of an interesting thing to see. The new is not always done by the young. And in fact, quite often not at all in that way. Sometimes the young, I feel like this is sometimes true increasingly, that the young has been sort of directed into, you should think this way, you should do this thing. And they're not really, one hopes that the young can think for themselves and pick up whatever is the right direction to go. But and maybe it's a constant of all time that some fraction do and some fraction don't. But in any case, so I did this grand kind of lecture tour, and at every university visited, talked to a bunch of faculty members, typically talked to the university president and so on. And there were a bunch of university presidents. So yeah, one thing that happened was kind of interesting. We'd have these lunches and things with faculty members, and there would be faculty members from all sorts of different departments. And it would be a very common thing at these lunches that people would say, oh yes, I'm so-and-so from the math department, I'm so-and-so from the biology department, whatever else. And they would say, oh, I don't think we've ever met. We've both been at the same university for 30 years, but we've never met. So it was kind of a nice thing that sort of the NKS story was enough of an interdisciplinary thing that it brought together these people from very different parts of the university. And, the university president folks noticed this, and they were like, this is cool. Let's, shouldn't we be doing some kind of thing at our university that kind of makes use of this sort of emerging area and this ability to sort of bring together people from different areas. And so that was the thing that we kind of started various discussions about. Maybe we should do kind of a rerun of my Center for Complex Systems Research kind of at some university, and that discussion got started in a number of places. One place where it went particularly far was Brown University. At that time, the provost at Brown was a chap called Bob Zimmer, who had been a chairman of the math department at the University of Chicago. Actually, my wife worked with him a bit there. He was particularly sort of enthusiastic and actually I can't remember the order of things, but we ended up sort of a thing that we did. Well, gosh, it must have been, we had this tour, and that sort of got started. These whole discussions about institutes got started as a result of the tour. But well, let me say a few more things about the tour, and then I'll come back to the institute starting initiatives. The tour, one fun thing that happened, see these audiences, all these, different audiences, and they're fairly large audiences, quite a few hundred people typically, or whatever it is, sometimes bigger than that. But somehow I noticed there was this one young guy, and I had noticed after the first 15 places, I was realizing this same young guy is showing up at all these different talks, and turned out to be a chap called Kovas Bogota. And one thing that was notable about him, he'd been a student at University of Chicago, actually. And one of the best reviews of the NKS book was in the University of Chicago student newspaper. And as later became clear, it was written by Kovas, who'd sort of stayed up all night, the day the book came out, written this review, filed it, and I don't know what, done what students do. But anyway, he decided it would be a fun kind of vacation or something to just go around to all these different talks and see and see how these different audiences reacted to things. It was quite interesting, and Kovas worked with us for a couple of years actually after that, more than a couple of years, quite a few years after that, on a variety of things. But it was just one of those unusual things that happens. But in any case, back to sort of institute starting. Well, I guess then one of the things that happened was people kept on saying, "Oh, we'd like to, learn more about NKS. We'd like to work with you, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera." And it was like, how are we going to deal with this? Well, actually, a friend of mine, Terry Sinofsky, computational neuroscience person who I'd known since the early 80s, and he'd done a thing which was about sort of early neural nets in the early part of the 80s, which was they'd had this series of summer schools about that stuff. And I knew from him that had been a successful effort. And so I sort of partly based on that, I'm like, okay, the way to deal with this is let's have a summer school about NKS, and let's take all these people who are writing to us and saying, can we interact with you, and have them, invite them to the summer school. So we did the first one of those in 2003. We've been doing these summer schools ever since. They've kind of changed a little bit in character since that time. But we did that first few actually at Brown University. And I think sort of around that time, we were kind of talking about this institute thing. But it was sort of interesting to see kind of the dynamics of what I had evolved into from running a company for many years and what was happening at universities, even with a very entrepreneurial kind of provost like Bob Zimmer. And it was kind of like, I'm like, well, I can get some project manager to try and interact about, figuring out how this thing gets structured, and, how do we take students, and how does it work, and so on and so on and so on. And Bob was like, well, I can get some faculty committee to do this or that. And it's like, this is not going to work. Faculty committee versus project managers who expect, this is going to happen, this is going to happen, this is going to happen. It just doesn't mix. And so we sort of gave up on that. Subsequently, Bob went off to be president of the University of Chicago and did lots of interesting things there. But the thing that so after, well, I guess I was after kind of the NKS book thing, I kind of dived back into doing things at the company, but was continuing to do some sort of researchy stuff along the lines of the NKS book. Particularly, I was interested in expanding what I'd done in fundamental physics and seeing how much further I could get. The one thing that was sort of a downer for all of that was my friends in physics were either didn't care or in some cases were sort of actively hostile about the whole thing. I would say that I noticed that, friends of mine in physics, I would try and describe what was going on in, in the things I was doing in the physics, in sort of this direction of physics, and I could not keep them from their eyes glazing over for more than 5 minutes. So I eventually this is not a thing. It's not working. I remember actually the aforementioned Steve Weinberg saying to me at some point, explaining, I met him in some other occasion, and saying, well, of course, this, talking about, well, I'm thinking about doing this physics project thing. And it's like, of course it won't work. Of course it won't work. But eventually he said, but please don't do this project. And I was like, well, why not? and say, well, if you're right, and of course you're not right, it's going to overturn the work we've done for the last 50 years. And I'm like, you're wrong about that. It's, the things that have been done on the standard model and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, they are what they are. And, they have all sorts of utility. If there is something else underneath, that's something that the current models are blind to. And yes, it would be cool. It's cool to reach the end to get to the final fundamental theory, but that doesn't invalidate the things that have been done on top of that. But then he said, but anyway, you won't be able to get any sort of young physicists to work with you. And it's like, I'm sorry, Steve, but you're wrong there because our company is full of bright young physicists, many of whom kind of got fed up with academia and decided that our company was a better environment. So in any case, I did work on sort of physics extensions of NKS for a little while. I never really wrote anything about them, and I didn't um, uh, and I sort of got dissuaded from doing that by by the fact that the market, which was I thought was basically physicists, um, would really wasn't into the product. I did finally figure out probably, or maybe a decade later, I sort of thought of it as, the search for the fundamental theory of physics is kind of an aspirational thing. It's like going to Mars. It's one of these, as a species, it's a cool thing to try to do. And so I had kind of thought about sort of mounting an effort in that direction where sort of the big story was an educational story. It's like, this is the thing we're trying to do. We may not succeed, but by the way, we can tell you about existing physics, and it's an aspirational thing for our species to be doing. So I kind of had that plan for a while, but didn't really get around to executing it. But then we're into the early 2000s, and let's see, a variety of things were happening. I was really trying to, company was in fine, stable form, but really wasn't doing a bunch of new stuff. And I was like, we're going to bring out a new version of Mathematica. It ended up being version 6. And we're going to I would say that things had sort of slowed down. If you look at the plot of the number of new functions as a function of time, it was a bit slow in the 1990s, partly because I was kind of a limiting factor, insisting on writing things in the book about all these functions and really sort of insisting on doing all the design, which I've continued to insist on. But that was, I was really, a lot was on me. And that really slowed things down, especially because I was doing another kind of night job, so to speak, too. So I guess the first few years of after 2002, I really was diving back into the company, trying to build version 6, make new things happen. Version 6 had a lot of new ideas. By that point, we'd sort of completely burnt through all the things that I had learned from SMP, and we were really dealing with completely new ideas and things that really had to be invented very much from scratch. And that was a lot of that happened in version 6 when we introduced all this dynamic interactivity, user interface building capabilities, and so on. So then what happened? I guess that we had a variety of projects about sort of an atlas of simple programs, all kinds of things like this. But then a weird thing of left field. Cell phone ringtones became popular. And there was the crazy frog ringtone, which became sort of a viral sensation. And there were all these other different things. And so I thought, well, wouldn't it be kind of interesting if you could kind of generate, kind of custom generate kind of musical elements the from simple rules. Actually, I should explain another thing. In year 2000, we had published a couple of books. We call them the Graphica books, which were kind of art books of imagery built with Mathematica. One person called art of a person called Igor Bakshi, another one Michael Trott, Um, these were sort of all kind of what we would now call Wolfram language, sort of all the way down. But that was sort of a poking our nose into sort of the artistic side of these things. And by the way, all the time I had been working on cellular automata and so on, there'd been a steady stream of kind of artistic uses of these things. I remember from the, oh gosh, must have been the mid 80s, you know, the gallery opening invitation, which unfortunately I couldn't go to, for a cellular automaton art showing that some people had put on in New York City. And there was a sort of a steady stream of these things. But then this must have been what, 2004, 2000, around that time, maybe 2005. Uh, we'd I thought, well, with things like cellular automata, you can kind of create sort of you can create things that have an artistic character from pure rules. And I had kind of noticed, you know, when I wrote Introduction to these Graphica books, I kind of made the point that it seemed like sort of these simple rules capture kind of the essence of what's happening in nature. And maybe I'm getting my dates wrong. Maybe those books came out a bit later than that. In any case, they sort of capture the essence of what happens in nature. And so when we see something, just as we find many things in the natural world kind of aesthetically pleasing and familiar, so when we see something that is abstractly produced by these same kinds of foundational rules, and we see that in a piece of sort of art or architecture, that kind of resonates with us in the same way that the natural world resonates. And so I was kind of wondering, you know, would that be the case in the kind of musical domain as well? And there was a chap at the company who was kind of into algorithmic musical composition. And so we kind of took cellular automaton patterns and just said, make this be a score for a piece of music. And it turned out you can make quite interesting kind of tunes from it that were kind of had a richness that came from this whole phenomenon of computational reducibility. They had a sort of diversity that came from the fact that every rule is kind of a world unto itself. And yet they had a certain familiarity, and they had a sort of a logical structure that carried through the piece. So we made some kind of interesting sounding things, and we thought we're going to launch this thing called Wolfram Tones and sort of have it be on the web and so on. I will say we first put up a website in 93, 94, sometime like that. And we had our first dynamic website in, I think, 96, 95 or 96, which was a thing we called the integrator. I think its tagline was the power to do integrals as no one has seen before. And it was a kind of a very colorful sort of thing where you type in an integral, and then we had a Mathematica backend that would compute it and give the result. And it was a rather popular website in its time. In any case, so we had some experience in dynamic websites. We built this website, and then we thought, foolishly, let's sell these ringtones. You know, it's kind of a fun consumer thing to do. And there began a 6-month long interaction with cell phone carriers and so on. And, you know, how do you sell a ringtone for a few pennies? And what was the dynamics of doing that? It was a nightmare. And it took 6 months. We eventually solved that problem. By that time, the ringtone craze was over, and our Wolfram Tones website was kind of hit at the wrong time. It got some media attention and other things. And I have to say, in the years since then, I've run into many kind of composer types who say things like, yes, it's an interesting site for getting sort of inspirations, seeds of ideas for sort of tunes that one can generate. It's also been used plenty in video games and in all sorts of other places. But in any case, that was an interesting thing for our company, because our company was, it was a Mathematica company. That's what we did. And people at the company were like, this tones thing is crazy. And, you know, it's kind of a waste of time, people thought. And the sad thing was that it kind of was a waste of time. It really didn't work out. And so people were like, oh, we should just stick to our knitting and do the things we know to do and just build the best Mathematica we can. Okay, well, meanwhile, one of the things that I guess, how did this come about? Well, partly it was sort of a generalization of that integrator website, and partly it was sort of a data collection thing that I kind of wanted to do ever since I was a kid. I'd been collecting kind of, data and scientific data and all this kind of thing and putting it all together. And I had thought for a long time, wouldn't it be great to kind of take the knowledge of the world and sort of package it up so that you could access it automatically? And I thought about that, particularly after I first was doing SNP. I had thought, how can we generalize this? We're doing something which has these definite rules for doing computation and so on. How can we generalize this to be sort of human-like thinking, or how can we generalize this to all knowledge, as opposed to just this kind of mathematical formal knowledge and so on? And so this must have been 1980 or so, I was thinking about, the basis of SNP and now Wolfram language is this kind of idea of pattern matching, of transforming symbolic expressions that match some pattern into other symbolic expressions that have a different structure. And I thought, well, isn't that the essence of what we humans do? We look at sort of the world and we identify patterns in the world, and we kind of, based on those patterns, we decide what to do next. And so I started thinking about how would one capture that? And so I had this idea of how would you do fuzzy pattern matching? How would you kind of do something like hash codes, where hash codes can kind of take sort of identify things? How would you combine hashing with pattern matching with sort of fuzziness, fuzzy hashing for pattern matching? So I started working on that. In fact, that was one of the things that got me interested in things like neural nets back in those days. One of the things that was, I guess, one of the origin stories for what got me interested in sort of how do complex things happen in the world. And I mentioned before, it was sort of the merger of things like galaxy formation, brains, snowflakes, and so on. And in the end, cellular automata are rather unsuitable for galaxy formation because gravity is a long-range force. They're fairly unsuitable for brains, or at least they seem to be, until perhaps very recently. Then they're more relevant to snowflakes and so on. But in any case, so that had been my kind of my story from the beginning of the 1980s, is can one do sort of fuzzy pattern matching to kind of deal with all the knowledge of the world, so to speak. Well, I'd kind of returned to that idea a bunch of times over the years, and it always been, no, I don't really see how to do this. And I'd had different ideas. I remember when I was consulting at Thinking Machines Corporation, where they were trying to build this sort of massively parallel computer that would be an AI. I remember actually one of their investors, William Paley of CBS fame, was saying, if the company invents the transistor of artificial intelligence, then, that will be the sort of the key thing. And later on, I think he got a lot more pragmatic about the company's actually got to make money, and that didn't work quite so well. But in any case, the thing that was, at that time as well, I was sort of thinking, what is the transistor of artificial intelligence? What is the kind of the core idea that will lead one to sort of a brain-like thing? And I'd had the notion that to do this thing of packaging up the world's knowledge and making it computable, so to speak, I wouldn't have used that terminology to describe it, but that's what it amounts to, that somehow one needed to make sort of a human brain-like thing, something very much like modern LLMs and so on. But I sort of imagined it was go through the brain-like phase to get to the thing that is this sort of packaging of knowledge, even though a lot of knowledge is not really encoded as a result of sort of the achievements of science, and formalization is not really encoded just in this kind of brain-like form. But anyway, that was my thought. So, okay, so then we're in 2004 or so, and I'm thinking about this again, and then I'm realizing there's something that I did in the NKS book. I invented this idea that I'd invented in the early 1990s. I remember actually the day I invented that idea was when we were living in California. I just out in nature, so to speak, thinking about this of what was really going on, and realizing this thing that I call the principle of computational equivalence, which talks about the fact that there's this sort of fundamental computational equivalence between these systems, from the ones with very simple rules to these things like brains. And so then I thought, well, wait a minute. This is now 2003, 2004. If I believe my own sort of philosophical conclusion, then you shouldn't need this kind of brain-like phase to get to the point where you can do all this, making all this knowledge computable. You should just be able to use computation. And by the way, I've just spent the last 20 something years building this big stack of computation that we should be able to use. So that was one kind of impetus. Then we sort of started thinking, will we make kind of a Wolfram plot? We'd made this integrator thing, will we make a plotting site, and this site, and that site? Well, my youngest son, Christopher, was at that point, I don't know, 7 years old or something. And I remember and he'd been learning what was then Mathematica, now Wolfram language. And he was like, and I remember I was driving he was in the back of the car I was driving, and he's saying to me, why do you have to write all this code? Why can't I just tell the thing in English what I want to do? And I'm like, well, that's really hard. People have tried to do that for a long time, and it's and then he's like, but there just aren't that many different ways you can say these things. It's a this, it's a that, you can, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm like, yeah, okay, I guess I should think more about this. And that was kind of the seed for thinking about kind of a general natural language interface. And that kind of combined with this kind of, I think we can make something that makes knowledge computable and so on. And so we kind of got launched on this idea of building what became Wolfram Alpha. It was at the beginning, it was called Calculate. Its earliest name was Calculate, and it's still in its internal code. There's lots of calculate, scan, this and that and the other, that are still there, just like the Omeg sort of archaeological piece of Mathematica's early name, Omega, still lives on in various places in code and so on. But in any case, the thing that then sort of got launched on this, well, let's try and kick the tires of this idea of making this general sort of question answering, package up the knowledge of the world in computable form type of thing. We got some small team working on it, and it got bigger and things started kind of working out. I remember one time I took some part of the team to a big reference library, I think in Illinois, and it was like, well, there's this big reference library. What we're going to do over the next year or so is take all the knowledge that's in here and make it computable. And they were like, that's totally crazy. But I was like, yeah, we're going to do it. And sure enough, we did. It wasn't obvious it was going to work, but one of the things that was sort of a challenge at that time was that our company, we'd had the Wolfram Tones project, which had been a commercial disaster. I mean, we didn't put a lot into it, but it made nothing as a commercial venture. And so there was a certain amount of, it's going to be another Tones. I mean, that for a long time, people have been long time people at our company. The Tones word has a connotation of, it's one of those crazy ideas that just doesn't make commercial sense. So I sort of had this challenge of how was I going to build this operation without it being sort of torn down by people saying it's going to be another Tones. And so we had this special projects group, and I eventually was sort of hiding about 200 people working in the special projects group. We were, by that point, a very geo-distributed company, so it wasn't sort of, there wasn't a lot of local visibility of the whole thing. And to the benefit, to the credit of my management team, once Wolfram Alpha was demoable, I showed it to them, and within half an hour or something, everybody was like, hey, this is really quite good. We can use it for this. We can do that. We can do this. Now, I have to say, the original idea was we're just going to build this thing. We're going to build it partly as a promo of all the cool things you can do with Mathematica and what's now the Wolfram language, and we're not going to kind of we don't really know how we're going to make money from it. And we had some ideas. Actually, my oldest son, who's a very talented business mind, although he's not doing business things anymore, the uh, built a business and decided he didn't like it. But he was still very young, but was one of the better brainstormers of how would we turn this thing into an actual business. And we had a bunch of ideas. One of the ideas was to work with companies that had complex products they were trying to sell, like, I don't know, internet service, and be able to kind of make a kind of trusted curation of what they were trying to sell and be able to knit that into the things that we were presenting in Wolfram Alpha. And that ended up being, that was too heavy a piece of lifting, but I thought it was sort of an interesting possibility of we have this website, we have sort of an independent organization that's kind of validating and curating information from companies, and that would be, and that they would then pay to be part of this whole story. And that was one kind of model that had kind of been born of the sort of then prevailing view of how the web works, so to speak. Well, then the I think, but we were getting ready to launch Wolfram Alpha, and we were kind of talking to a variety of companies about it, and with varied responses. I've later learnt that well, there were two companies that were quite interested, IBM and Google. IBM was at that time had done their whole sort of Jeopardy thing, and they were sort of getting ready to launch the whole Watson thing, and they were sort of very interested in what we had on offer. And Google, I learnt more recently, was much more paranoid than they should have been about the things that we were doing, and behaved in some very unfortunate ways, probably as a result. But another company that was sort of just trying to get the whole search thing going was Microsoft, and uh, I had kind of um, interacted with those folk, and Nathan Myhrvold, who I'd mentioned earlier, was at that point, was he? No, I think he had stopped being CTO at that point, but was still involved. I'm not sure I'm getting my history quite straight. But in any case, uh, at that time, Microsoft was trying to launch Bing, and they got very interested in being able to integrate um, kind of Wolfram Alpha capabilities into Bing, and we made a nice deal with them right before Wolfram Alpha was launched, which kind of made me feel better about having spent all the money we spent on developing Wolfram Alpha. But anyway, then we launched Wolfram Alpha, and one of the questions was how much traffic would we get on day one? And we had no idea. And the thing that had happened, there'd been a couple of services. There was a search engine called Cool, and there was another thing called True Knowledge that had launched, and both of them had kind of fallen over as a result of, um, I think in those days it was Slashdot was the kind of the viral source, and they just got too much traffic, and the whole system had fallen over. So I was like, let's not do that. So we arranged to borrow a lot of sort of supercomputer level capability, and we had set up our own kind of colos and so on. At that time, it wasn't realistic, and it still isn't actually. It isn't cost effective anymore to use kind of cloud services because you couldn't. There was a lot of stuff with databases and so on that you couldn't really uh, uh, serve with other people's clouds and so on. So we had to build our own infrastructure, which we did. And actually, Michael Dell was kind enough to make us a great deal on a bunch of computers at that time, and the that put in good service for many years in serving Wolfram Alpha. But a bunch of other a bunch of other people and things in the computer industry that we interacted with. In any case, we're sort of getting ready to launch Wolfram Alpha, and we uh, we're trying to have the thing not fall over. I had talked to the people at Cool who were like, yeah, there was some bug in their logging software, and then somebody else had some other problem. And it's like, let's try and run whatever tests we can, and let's try and make sure we have enough capacity, because we had no idea. I had a guess I think my guess was 100 QPS, 100 queries per second. Um, but we had provisioned the thing, I think, up to 500 QPS, if I remember correctly. Um, and the the thing that, and then I thought, well, uh, let's um, how are we going to make this not a huge embarrassment if the thing does fall over? Well, okay, there's another sub story to tell here. So back, when was it? Sometime in it must have been 2004-ish time frame. I got to know a chap called Paul Graham, who was living in Cambridge, Massachusetts at the time. And Paul started this thing called Y Combinator. And it was in a converted chocolate factory in Cambridge, rather lovely colorful building. Um, and so he'd started this thing, and he had these people who'd sort of come, these bunch of kind of college kids who were coming for the summer to do startups. And so I went to a bunch of, they had dinners every week, and I went to a bunch of those, and actually was that must have been, when was this? This was, how did these dates align? I'm trying to think. I'm losing track of time of what happened when. Um, but um, in any case, the thing uh, that um, was so I had interacted a bunch with the whole Y Combinator and Paul's now wife Jessica Livingston. Jessica, I don't know what she goes by now. She was Jessica Livingston. I think she still is. The Who was also involved in building up Y Combinator. But and I remember that the original demo day, the very first demo day, it was Paul was like, "Can you come to this thing?" And my older son was very into business, was probably, I don't know how old, and 12 years old, maybe, I forget. Have to work out the dates. And I'm like, sure, we'll come. It was a very small group of people. It was like, and I remember one guy who was there who was explaining that, yeah, he'd been running some company, and he got really fed up with a bunch of capitalists, and so he installed his dog as the CEO. I thought that was kind of an interesting backstory. Anyway, small group of people to watch these demos. These demos ended up being of lots of well-known companies like Reddit and Looped, which was Sam Altman's company, and oh my gosh, a bunch of others that were there in that first demo day. Actually, my son commented that Sam Altman seemed like the most business-like person presenting that day, which turned out to be an interesting comment. But there was one company that presented, a company called Kiko, as two guys, Justin Kan and Emmett Shear. And Kiko was a calendar system, a web-based, cloud-based calendar system. And my son was saying, that's the one you should invest in. So we had some discussions with them. Unfortunately, the people at our company were like, this calendar isn't that good, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we didn't invest in it. And eventually they sold that company, I think, for $50,000 on eBay. But then they went and started Twitch, which became much more successful. But well, actually, what they started before that was Justin.tv, where Justin Cam was wearing some webcam or something and transmitting his life or whatever else. That had just happened right before we were about to launch Wolfram Alpha. This is now 2009. And so I thought, thinking of this, well, why don't we use Justin.tv and why don't we live stream our launch event and try um, and kind of if the whole thing falls over and is a disaster, at least people will sort of share the event, and maybe we'll show that we weren't complete idiots, and knew what we were doing, and didn't sort of break things unnecessarily. But anyway, so we were getting ready to kind of live stream this, and we built this kind of mission control like set of dashboards and a room and all this kind of thing. And it was kind of cool. And then then what happened is that was a Friday night, I think, that we'd kind of gotten everything more or less set up and we were getting ready to do things. And somehow by mistake, the site went live. And that was actually very useful because we got a lot of traffic and it wasn't live for very long. It was live for like 45 minutes or something, but a bunch of traffic started flowing in. And that was very helpful to see what would actually happen with the system. But then, oh, I'm forgetting all the days of the week and when exactly things happened. But uh, then we were kind of ready. I think we were going to go live on a Saturday night, maybe, or I've forgotten. I think it was Saturday night, and was May 15th, 2009. And we but I had thought, we're going to live stream this, but it's going to be the world's most boring piece of television because, in the end, we're just going to press a button and then, the thing's going to go live and it's like whatever. But Theo Gray, person who has developed the notebook interface, head of our user interface group, um, had had worked at the company since very early days, actually had gotten a little bored at the company and had started doing some extracurricular activities. One of his extracurricular activities was that he'd read about a periodic table, and he had this idea that it somehow meant a physical table. So he had built this wooden table, which he wanted to fill with, one sample each of all the different chemical elements. So this table for a long time sat in our offices. It was the best tourist attraction of our offices in Illinois. But Theo had kind of gone off and done this sort of this thing doing that, and had built a little side business where he started making periodic table posters that are up in a large number of chemistry, school chemistry labs and so on. And I think maybe had done some books based on sort of taking photographs of these samples of chemical elements, and had also started a little business with a chap called Max Whitby, who was a person who was at that time running a production company that made documentaries for the BBC. And actually, of all small world things, I had known Max Whitby a bit when I was an undergraduate in Oxford, and also a chap who's long worked for our company, who I also knew back from that time, a chap named Tom Wickham-Jones, had also known him. And so anyway, we thought, and Theo had kind of connected with him and was doing this kind of periodic table business with him, kind of selling periodic tables to the good and great and so on. And so we thought, well, Max kind of knows something about producing television programs. Let's have him sort of help with the production of this sort of television-like event. So he did, and it was quite good, although there were many aspects of it where this is going to be the most boring television didn't pan out as expected, because among other things, many things, of course, didn't work. As you know, there were moments where the whole network connectivity failed and all sorts of servers failed and so on and so on and so on. And then we were doing this at this facility in Illinois. And then right a couple of hours before, we had knew we kind of had, monitors up with, weather radar and stuff like this, because we knew there were potential issues. And then it's like, well, that was also part of the let's have a mission control like setup. And that's what you do if you have a mission control like setup. But then it turned out to be important because the weather forecast called for a tornado in the area that was actually heading for our location. And so that made for a bunch of additional drama, although as it turned out, the tornado dissipated before it got to us. But anyway, so then, Wolfram Alpha went live. We had a lot of media coverage. At the time, I think it was like, is this a search engine that's going to attack Google? Well, I kept on saying, it's not a frigging search engine. It's a knowledge engine. It's a computational knowledge engine. It's not a search engine. It has nothing to do with, it's something which is an adjunct to the story of searching the web. And actually, I think due to my oldest son was the sort of the metaphor of Google, pick up the world's garbage and deliver it to people type thing. And that was an unkind view of, what the search process is. But, we were like, the whole sort of idea of Wolfram Alpha is we're building something which can actually compute things rather than just giving you here a bunch of links to go look at. So in any case, but the media coverage was it's a search engine, it's a competitor to Google. It's like, no, it's not. No, it's not. No, it's not. The but so Wolfram Alpha got off to a good start, and I remember that first evening, the first bug reports. I do have to tell a couple of stories about that since I'm telling stories. We were wondering, kind of sort of what should we do if the thing failed? Actually, there was a chap, friend of mine named Nova Spivak, who happened to be there because we'd invited a few people. He was sort of involved with helping us do PR for sort of getting the word out. This was at a time, this was 2009, when kind of, Twitter and things like that were young. But we were trying to be smart about dealing with both old media and new media. It was sort of a moment of transition between those things. Actually, the chap who'd done publicity for the NKS book was dealing with old media. I was going a little bit crazy watching all these new media things happening, and he couldn't do the embargo information and things like this. And it was like, what are you doing? You're putting all this stuff out and so on. But it was sort of a time of transition between those two modalities. But in any case, I think Nova suggested that we should have kind of a HAL-like I'm sorry, Dave, I can't do that type image that came up when something went wrong with a Wolfram Alpha result. And in the first hours of Wolfram Alpha being up, there were some kind of bug reports that were, bug reports you remember. So one of them was from a person responding to that saying, "How did you know my name was Dave?" Obviously, it was a generic thing, but he happened to be called Dave, but it seemed more personal, so to speak. There was another one that was sort of an unforgettable one, which was, when you ask about a city, whatever that city is, it might be Omsk. You ask about the city of Omsk, and it will tell you, the population of Omsk and the metro area population of Omsk, and so on. The bug report was Omsk has no metro. Somebody who lived in Omsk, who maybe wasn't, perfect on English, saw this metro area population, and I guess it's like maybe the thought was it's, people, using the metro or something. But anyway, that was one of those bug reports you don't forget of the kind of Omsk has no metro. Sort of the nature of the bug reports that one got for Wolfram Alpha were very, very different from anything we'd ever seen for Mathematica, where there's sort of a precise, definite right answer. Actually, in the development of Wolfram Alpha, one of the things that have been interesting for me was, the development of Mathematica and now Wolfram language is all about sort of a precise, well thought out, very foundational, primitive design that's very coherent. For Wolfram Alpha, the goal was just make it do what people expect. And it could be very inconsistent. There could be one thing and you make a very small change, and that means something very different in the world. I seem to remember one of our classic examples was the rapper 50 Cent, who was to be distinguished from 51 Cent, which was probably there's now also a rapper by that name, I don't know, but which was by that, which was meant 51 cents of money. And so that's a deeply inconsistent thing. And a few people who worked on kind of design analysis for Mathematica, I sort of put them to work on Wolfram Alpha, and I would say I remember one person in particular who it was the closest I've seen to sort of a human head exploding, so to speak, of like, I just don't get it. How can we have this thing? There's a person who is very, very good at kind of coherent design, and it's like, this is just crazy. Having these things where 50 cents works differently from 51 cents and so on. But for me, it was a very interesting experience, kind of going from this very precise sort of discipline of design to this just do what the user wants, just do what I mean type thing. in the end, it's been a very powerful thing bringing together those two design modalities. But at the time, it was really for me, it was important to have this sort of clean break of doing something very different in the design modality. It also was important that I had worked on many kind of grand theories, like NKS, for example. But for Wolfram Alpha, my biggest theory was not to have a theory. That is, we didn't try and make a global ontology of the world that would would kind of into which we could fit all these pieces of knowledge. Instead, we built out each different area with whatever was needed to build out that area. And that worked out really well because we gradually sort of saw these commonalities and could build these larger pieces of infrastructure that would sort of accelerate what we could do. But we had things that actually worked for all these different areas. I have to say another thing about the release of Wolfram Alpha. One of the things I mentioned in the release of the NKS book in 2002, that some of the people who are sort of closest to the biz, like what I would call the complexicoids, the complex systems research folk, the complexicoids were kind of like, we don't want this. You gave us something 15 years ago, and we're real happy with that. We don't want a new thing. Well, the community that Wolfram Alpha was sort of launching itself, in the direction of was the AI community, and the AI community had for many years there had been efforts to build question answering systems. They had always failed. 2009 was probably the low point of AI. Expert systems had kind of petered out. Neural nets weren't a thing. Nobody took them very seriously, and it was kind of just AI was at a low ebb, and nobody took it seriously. It's a story I've told a number of times, but right when we were about to launch Wolfram Alpha, I happened to see Marvin Minsky, who's an AI pioneer who I'd known for many years, and I'd say, "Let me give you this demo of the system. It's a question answering system," and he's like looking at it for 2 minutes, and then he's like talking about something completely different. And I was like, "Marvin, you should actually look because it actually works." So he types in a few more things, and then we were at some event together, and he's like, "Oh my God, it actually works." And then he's running around telling other people, "You got to see this, you got to see this. It actually works." Now, a thing that I would say was very nice about that was sort of AI, the traditional approaches, and Marvin's various kind of almost psychologically based approaches that he'd adopted at that time had kind of petered out. But, he could see this was something that actually worked. And it was kind of in that direction. He was excited about it. Another person who sort of tried to do a lot of stuff with kind of common sense knowledge was Doug Lennart, who I'd known since the early 80s, doing a bunch of things that were somewhat questionable. He had an artificial mathematician. It kind of reminds me of modern times. This was in the early 80s, that was sort of discovering new theorems. And I'd been very suspicious about it. I really didn't believe in it. I thought it was sort of a put-up job. And later on, I think Doug had the misfortune of being kind of identified as a micro-Lennart, as a unit of bogosity, of, is this a bogus thing or not? Anyway, so Doug was another person very much in this kind of encode knowledge type thing. And he basically said to me, when Wolfram Alpha came out, he said, "Okay, you win. I give up." And he didn't actually give up, I'm happy to say. But what I explained to him was, look, here's what happened. You tried to do this on sort of medieval basis. You were thinking about natural philosophy, thinking about using logic as a foundation for thinking about the world, and everything was sort of supposed to fit into a human thinking type pattern. We didn't do that. We cheated. We just used all the stack of stuff that's been built in modern science, where you don't just have to reason about whether this, projectile will go in this trajectory or whatever. You just calculate it. And so we were able to do this sort of end run around the sort of the true AI-like approach. But one of the things that was very different from the NKS book sort of story was people close to the biz, I think, really liked Wolfram Alpha. I wouldn't have said Wolfram Alpha was an AI system, certainly not at the time. I just saw it as being a computational knowledge engine. But in any case, it got off to a good start. one of the things that was sort of a disaster was we had been doing our summer school every year, and we had been doing it. We did it at Brown for a number of years, then we did it at the University of Vermont for a number of years, and then we thought, let's branch out. Let's do it in somewhere else in the world. And we had a chap in Pisa, Italy, had provided various facilities and so on. And we're like, let's do the summer school there. And we had set the summer school, 9 months in advance. And we were like, this isn't going to conflict with the release of Wolfram Alpha. It's going to be, it's going to be far, far away from that time. Well, needless to say, everything collided. And 2 weeks after Wolfram Alpha was released, there I was going off to the summer school in Italy. And, we were doing all these deals and there were all these technical issues. And it was kind of a disaster because there I was with bad cell phone coverage. I also got sick in the middle of the whole thing. And it was a not to be repeated thing. So ever since then, we've tried to keep the summer school in a place that's real close to where I'm going to be anyway, and where I kind of have a good home base. It's usually been around Boston. I should say that the invention of the name Alpha, Wolfram Alpha, for it was something which we'd had many ideas. I'd thought about many different ideas, many ideas. As is so often the case with names, I remember I was driving in a particular place and I had this idea of this name. And I had to make this call to this young fellow who was working on Wolfram Alpha at the time. And I said, oh, I had this idea for this name. And, Wolfram Alpha. He's like, yes, that's a good name. I could be proud of working on something like that. But it was something where when you get the name, you kind of know it immediately. And actually, I've been working on a name for a new thing that we're doing, and I was thinking about it actually driving in that very same spot, and I thought maybe this is the spot where I can have an inspiration about names. I did come up with a name, but I don't think it's that inspired for that particular thing. In any case, let's see. So we're now 2009. Wolfram Alpha is launched. Took a bunch of time to sort of get Wolfram Alpha to really build the Wolfram Alpha technology stack and so on. I had a post not long after Wolfram Alpha came out called something like Overcoming Artificial Stupidity. I had started, by that point, I had started writing sort of a blog-like thing and started actually writing stuff. I hadn't really been writing much since the time of the NKS book. I guess I'd written a few bits and pieces. I'd written things on the 100th anniversary of von Neumann's birth, 100th anniversary of Gödel's birth, and so on. I'd written a few small pieces for those things, but I hadn't had sort of a systematic outlet. So I kind of started having that at that time. And I think kind of the overcoming artificial stupidity was a large part of the Wolfram Alpha story. We eventually ascended to the point where for many kinds of queries, we're, hitting, I don't know what it is these days, but, 98% success rate of understanding the query. And, the one question that I had at the time was, there was all this history of people having failed at making question answering systems. How come we succeeded? And I realized that the answer was, well, because we were doing something a bit different. We weren't trying to make a system where just the computer would understand what we said in some abstract sense. We were really more trying to make a translator from natural language, human language, to our existing computational language, from which we could then compute things. So that was a much easier problem than the one that people had previously been trying to solve, which was just to sort of have the computer understand everything. So in any case, let's see, I mean, we did many things with Wolfram Alpha. I was doing a bunch of stuff at the company. I think in 2012, I was, for some reason, I was at South by Southwest giving some big talk, and I thought I will just talk about something different. And I ended up talking about personal analytics. And I had been for many years by that time, since the late 80s, I had been storing, all my email. I'd been scanning all my paper documents. I had been really collecting a big kind of sort of story of my life, and I have a very good archive, I would say. And I've been sitting here telling the story of my life, but actually a much better and probably much longer version of this could be got from the archive that I have. One of the challenges of that archive is always, what do you put out in the public and what do you not? And at what point when people are dead, when stories are over, how much of what happened do you expose? And actually in this live stream, I've been sort of talking about things I've never talked about before, and sort of filling in a few of those details. But there's a lot more that one could fill in. I think as we get closer to modern times, it gets more complicated because I could talk about, well, lots of things. I could talk about my children. I could talk about people at my company. I could talk about companies we've interacted with. I could talk about companies I've been an advisor to. There are many different things along those lines I could talk about, but I feel like it's not time. It's not things are not it's not the moment to sort of reflect on that history. So I think I'll uh, for some so I'm going to be able to speed up a lot in my storytelling here. And I would say that one thing I can say, I remember talking of social media. I remember that 2009, August 29th, 2009, my 50th birthday, and uh, I thought it would be fun. My first tweet was made at the minute of the 50th anniversary of when I was born. So that means I can remember when I got on to social media like that. But in any case, the I had started doing more kind of writing things, and I wrote somehow I wound up writing a lot of obituaries for people I've known, and I find people interesting. I've always been interested in people. I kind of look at the sort of long arc of what happens in people's lives, hence yakking about my own. In one of these funny situations, if apples don't fall as far from the tree as you might expect, my father was wrote some novels, and which I have to say I was a very bad child in that respect of never reading these novels, and I'm not sure I've fully got through them actually even at this point. But one of the things that's sort of ironic is they are stories of sort of the long arc of human lives. I think particularly in connection with World War II and kind of the consequences of sort of for people's lives and the arc of their lives from that time. And so it's one of those things where you can't quite escape the apple tree, so to speak, in the things you do and are interested in. And so I've somehow I always used to give my father a hard time because he would get a newspaper and he would always turn to the obituary page in the newspaper, and he always found that the most interesting page to read. And I'm kind of a bit embarrassed to admit that that's become my thing. Well, there's some professional societies where I'm not sure the field is that alive, but the obituaries are interesting, and that becomes the highlight of the thing. I mean, I think that I have been uh, in a sense, if I look at the things I've done, I could easily have wound up staying as a physics professor at Caltech or something. But although I had kind of exited the physics story by about 1980, 1981, which was very good timing because I was sort of there for its period, like the AI burst, wave of today. I was there for the really exciting part, and I was not there for the long build of many, many years that came after that. Well, anyway, then by the 2010s, I was working on well, I guess another thing that was happening in the 2010s was I, for many years, really not traveled much at all. And I had kind of, had one of those plane charter subscriptions, and I was kind of like, if I'm going to travel, it's going to cost a ton of money, so it has to really be worth doing. And so the end result was I hadn't really traveled at all. And then my kids were getting older, and my older daughter um, was really interested in traveling, and uh, she was doing kind of my kids had been doing sort of homeschooling, but she was doing kind of online high school at that point. And the and she was like, "You get these invitations to all these places all over the world. Why don't you show them to me and let me pick the ones we should go to?" So that started, I don't remember when it was, 2011 maybe. Um, and the first one was a conference on an island off the Barrier Reef in Australia. And it was like 2 weeks from when, I don't know, for a short time. And so I was like, okay, I guess I'm into this. So we started traveling to all sorts of places, all sorts of interesting places around the world. And my daughter, Catherine, ended up um, doing her online classes from very bizarre locations at very bizarre times of the day. Um, in and So I put some kinds of did a certain amount of traveling and so on. There were other things that were happening. I mean, we had got, and this must have been 2010, particularly through Theo Gray, we had got an iPad before iPads were out and about in the world. Steve Jobs had basically been like, "I think you guys will do something interesting with this. Um, you know, I'll give you one under sort of almost armed guard because it was still very secret at the time." And that led to this a company called Touch Press that we spun off that made iPad ebooks, starting with a chemical elements, spinning around chemical elements type thing. I was quite involved in that at the beginning and in sort of insisting on spinning it off, but quickly wasn't so involved. But many different things happening along those lines, and I would say sort of doing a bunch of traveling and writing obituaries and things like this, and then building up to sort of the real conception of Wolfram language and this whole computational language as a way to think about things in the world and so on. And that had been sort of spawned by kind of data from Wolfram Alpha and so on, and understanding these ideas about computable data. And that was sort of emerging, and that was kind of, and then lots of technology stuff of starting to do developing our cloud and this and that and the other. A lot of technology, and I have to say, I was doing a lot of things. I was getting maybe a little bit bored, and then sometime in the early 2010s, we've been doing these summer schools every year. There'd been a young Russian chap named Max Piskunov who had come to our summer school, and he said, "I really want to work on this physics project that you've defined." And he and I said, "Well, the problem is that I'm really off doing other things, and I'm not really concentrating on that right now." He's like, "I really want to work on this." Anyway, he ended up doing a bit at that time, and then ended up trying to go to graduate school in the US to do it. And people told him, "Oh, we're network scientists, but we're really not interested. We were physicists, but we're not interested in physics anymore." But in any case, then years go by, and it gets to, what was it, 2017, 2018. There's another young chap named Jonathan Gorard, physicist, who was a student at our summer school. I remember he was a very ambitious young fellow. I remember him saying, "Well, I want to do a project, and it's either going to be about cosmology or it's going to be about theorem proving." So I was like, I wasn't convinced about the cosmology thing. So I said, "Well, why don't you do theorem proving?" And so he did. He did a nice piece of work, and which ended up being sort of the core of what became find equational proof in Wolfram language. But it then was the ultimate irony that a bit later, well, okay, so I have to tell more of the story. Then this must have been 2019. I am back at the summer school. Max has pretty much finished his PhD, and Jonathan's back at the summer school, I think, as an instructor by that time. And I'm talking to these guys, and oh, yes, an important point. That's right, Max had been doing some sort of volunteer work on the physics project, sort of building some tooling and so on. And I'd continue to think about it. And I'd like, if this is going to go somewhere, we need to have better tooling. Sometime in 2018, I had this idea of I had thought about graph rewriting a lot. And that's what I had kind of based my ideas about fundamental physics on in the NKS book. And I thought there'd been some sort of technical issues with that. And I thought, let's think about hypergraphs. remember I was driving from actually back from New York City, and usually I have phone calls all the way. I have a whole list of call while driving calls to make. But for some reason, I was not doing that or something at that call and that time, and I was thinking of I've got a theme here, I guess, going of maybe I should do more drives without having phone calls, and I would have more ideas. I don't know, but having this idea about hypergraphs, and I got home, and within a few hours, I had kind of got all kinds of things going about kind of hypergraph rewriting and such like. But anyway, Max had worked on that in 2018, early 2019, came to the summer school, and then Jonathan and Max were like, um, uh, this physics project thing, you really got to do it. It's really interesting. And I said, well, if you'll help me, let's see what we can do. And so we're like, okay, we're going to do this. We're going to do this. And not a lot happened for a couple of months. And then it was my birthday, my 60th birthday. And I had a lovely party and invited lots of people. I unfortunately decided to do the party only a bit too close in time to when it happened. So it wasn't as good a collection as it might have been. But I gave a speech. My wife had been like, your speech is terrible. You shouldn't, because I'd written something out, and she gave a very good speech, but which is very unusual for her to give a speech at all. But my rather wooden speech, I would say, contained a bunch of statements about how, look, I'm going to try doing this physics project. Now, a bunch of friends of mine who are physicists who were there, who I think completely forgot that I said that. But then I had decided, I'm getting ancient. And if I'm ever going to do this physics project thing, which I've been thinking about doing for years, it's kind of a now or never type situation. And so kind of launched into doing this with Max and Jonathan. And it quickly became clear that we were going to make a lot of progress very, very fast. And a lot of things that I had not had any idea how they would work. It's just like particularly with the sort of hypergraph thing and some ideas about quantum mechanics and so on, it all just started to fall into place. And by in the fall of 2019, it was like, oh my gosh, we're going to figure out how physics works. And I was telling Max and Jonathan, you will never see this again. Savor this moment because it never works as easily as this. And we figured out lots of stuff. And then it was, I guess, we planned on March of 2020 that we were going to sort of do the grand reveal and start telling people about it. And of course, March of 2020 was when the pandemic was rolling in. And so that all became more dramatic and so on. And but we eventually sort of announced the project in April of 2020 and started. Well, actually, I had started doing a couple of years earlier. I had started doing live streaming of design reviews, software design reviews. So we were doing sort of live streaming stuff, the physics project, and so on. And I think maybe I should stop here. I could tell a little bit more about kind of the arc of science that I've done since 2019, since 2020. It's gone fantastically well. I never imagined that the things that it's been possible to figure out would be possible to figure out. It's been kind of this great gift that is kind of a next career or something that started up at an ancient age, and we're not even it's still ramping up, and it's still kind of we hit physics, foundations of mathematics, foundations of biology, foundations of machine learning. I'm hoping to do economics. I think this paradigm, which is kind of a thing that builds on the NKS paradigm, is really an amazing thing, and it's really something that's going to be something where you can kind of see it's sort of a follow-on, I think, to a lot of what was done a century and a half ago in a bunch of fields where people had sort of formalized things to the point where they hit two things. They hit basically computational irreducibility, and they hit the importance of observers in what we actually perceive in the universe. They hit those two kinds of blocks, and they didn't get over those blocks. And I think finally I understood in the 80s this sort of computational irreducibility story, understood it better in the 1990s, understood kind of this observer theory story much more in 2019 and beyond. And I think we get to kind of take the next steps in lots of science that's 100, 150 years of kind of fairly of being blocked, which is really exciting. And meanwhile, the technology we built, which and this kind of concept of sort of making the world computational, sort of building this computational language, this is something where sort of it's become more and more clear this is the future. Whether it's the future of this year or 50 years from now is a little hard to tell, but many things are sort of converging on that. Then there's the kind of modern AI boom, which we've been quite involved with, and which is sort of dovetails in this quite wonderful way with the kinds of things we built. Although that's not yet clear to everybody, but it's certainly been clear to me from the beginning of this. But the future is yet to unroll on that. But anyway, if there may be a few questions here, I can try and answer them. And I think I am sort of done with I'm almost done with the sort of story of my life as I'm prepared to tell it right now, I think. There probably an infinite, if you start poking on things in the last 30 years or so, there are probably an infinite number of stories that don't that I could tell, and sort of more in a decade or something. But let's see. Peter is asking, was working as a remote CEO strange when I started doing it in 1991? Yeah, it was totally bizarre. People were like, even any time before the pandemic, when I said, look, I've been a remote CEO for, some, 30 years or whatever it is, people were like, what? How could that possibly be? It was something where then it was like, people saying you're micromanaging this or that thing. And it's like, but I'm a remote CEO. And yes, it was an unusual thing at the time. I think companies adapt to sort of the culture they build, and this was a kind of a thing where we sort of just adapted to this idea of remote work, and it's worked very well for our company in many ways. I could talk about that separately. Ollie asks, what did a day in the life look like while you were writing NKS? I got up at kind of it was often, I don't think I made it up until midday or later than that, many days. And then I would do company stuff for a number of hours. Then I would go hang out with my kids, sort of in the dinner time period, and then by 9 o'clock or something, I would go back to work, and I would work until 4 in the morning, 5 in the morning, 6 in the morning, and and that was kind of my story. And I would occasionally do sort of phone calls to Europe and things deep into the night. I remember one very bizarre situation with, well, it's a different story, a story about AT&T and fraud detection and phone calls late in the night, and people I knew who were proud of their fraud detection system, and some craziness with that. But that was kind of my pattern, 7 days a week. And I was kind of working on a page a day. I was very happy if I wrote a page a day. Every so often I would write a bit more, and I would sort of regret it, and have to do more work on that. Joe asks, how long were you in Illinois? Were winters new to you? Well, I'd been in California until 1983, and then I was in New Jersey for until 1986. Then I was in Illinois until 1991, and then in California briefly, and then back in Illinois actually. So I think I was. I remember when I moved to New Jersey. I remember I was still sort of trying to wear the Birkenstock sandals when there was snow on the ground. Marco is asking, how did I meet my wife? Who I think is trying to call me right now, but which means I probably should go soon. But actually, in New York City, one day through she's a mathematician, and I probably would have met her at some point anyway because I knew lots of mathematicians. But through kind of a mutual friend. I'd been at some event. It was getting some random award, and the award sort of thing had finished early, and so I was going to visit this friend of mine, and my wife happened to be there, and that's how we met. Um, and people ask, has your wife ever worked for the company? No, she has not. That wouldn't work well. Uh, let's see. Do you like real paper books or ebooks more? I have about 9,000 books, which I've accumulated over the years. They make their own story. Maybe I'm planning at some point when I can actually get good video taken that I'll do a little bit of a tour of my library and maybe I'll tell some more stories there. JKO asked, after finishing NKS, do you feel relieved, exhausted, already itching for the next project? As I said, it's one of the only times in my life when I was tired. And I think I was, it really was, doing the NKS book was kind of the most sort of extreme tenacity exercise in my life. And it was kind of and I think the big achievement in a sense was just to finish the thing. And, I think I could have spent the rest of my life trying to do it. And I'm going to push hard enough to finish this thing. And I think that I also thought to myself, if I had done the NKS book right out of my science in the 1980s, could I have done it? And the answer was no. I I had to build mathematical and Wolfram language to be able to do NKS. So even though I spent, 5 years just doing that, that probably took 40 years off the time it would have taken to do NKS and made possible lots of things. So having that tooling that I built was the thing that that really made the NKS project possible. Let's see. People supporting the idea of a library tour. I'm going to do it. I'm just have to get it set up. Okay, last question here from Olaman. Do you have a collection of my old computers and hardware? Yes, some of it. Not as much as I would like. I was a little frustrated recently that some things I don't have, but yes, I have a lot of it, and that would be another kind of slightly dusty tour of things. All right, I think it is time for me to go. And thanks for listening to this very long drawn out story of my life. I'm glad it accelerated in the later years. Thanks very much, and bye for now. And we'll be back to other Q&A live streams next week.